If you had asked me a year ago to describe my life, I would have told you it was ordinary, maybe even enviable in its simplicity. I was 50, married to a man I'd loved for more than half my life, and blessed with a circle of friends who felt more like family. Our days were filled with routines that brought comfort. Morning coffee with my husband, Mark, the gentle clatter of dishes as we prepared breakfast together, the quiet moments spent reading side by side in the evenings. There was a rhythm to our lives, a sense of security that I never questioned. Among my friends, no one was closer to me than Julia. We met in our 20s, two young women navigating the chaos of early adulthood, and our bond only deepened as the years passed. Julia was the kind of friend who remembered every birthday, who showed up with soup when I was sick, who knew when to offer advice and when to simply listen. She was vivacious, quick-witted, and always the life of any gathering. Mark liked her too, and I took comfort in the easy camaraderie they shared. It made me proud in a way to see the two people I cared about most getting along so well. As Julia's 50th birthday approached, I found myself swept up in the excitement of planning her party. She wanted something intimate, just a handful of close friends and family, a night to celebrate the milestone with laughter and good food. I volunteered to help organize everything, from the guest list to the menu, eager to make the evening special for her. Mark was supportive, offering to help with the heavy lifting, and even suggesting a few of Julia's favorite songs for the playlist. It felt like we were all in this together, a trio bound by years of shared memories. Yet beneath the surface, there were moments when I caught myself wondering if things were truly as perfect as they seemed. Mark and I had weathered our share of storms, arguments over money, the slow drift that comes with raising children and growing older, the silent resentments that sometimes lingered after a harsh word or a forgotten anniversary. We always found our way back to each other, but I couldn't ignore the subtle changes. The way he sometimes seemed distracted, the late nights at work, the way he'd grown quieter over the past year. I told myself it was just the ebb and flow of a long marriage, nothing more. With Julia too, there were fleeting moments of doubt. She was beautiful, even at 50, with a confidence I sometimes envied. I'd noticed how people gravitated toward her, how she could light up a room with her laughter. There were times I wondered if I leaned on her too much, if my friendship was as important to her as hers was to me. But those thoughts were quickly dismissed, replaced by the comfort of her presence, and the certainty that we would always be there for each other. The week of the party was a whirlwind of activity. I spent hours on the phone with Julia, finalizing details and sharing in her excitement. Mark teased me about my party planner persona, but I could see he was looking forward to the evening as much as I was. On the day of the party, our house was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of music drifting from the speakers. I wore a new dress, a gift from Julia, and felt a rare sense of anticipation as the first guests began to arrive. Looking back, I realize how much I took for granted in those moments. The warmth of my home, the trust one placed in the people I loved, the belief that nothing could shake the foundation we had built together. I remember standing in the kitchen, watching Mark and Julia laugh over a shared joke, feeling a surge of gratitude for the life we had created. If only I had known what that night would set in motion, I might have held on to that feeling a little longer. The evening of Julia's birthday party arrived with a kind of electric anticipation. Our home was transformed, candles flickering on every surface, the dining table laden with dishes I'd spent the day preparing. The air was filled with the scent of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and Julia's favorite lemon cake cooling on the counter. Friends filtered in, arms full of flowers and bottles of wine, their laughter echoing through the hallway as they greeted one another with hugs and easy conversation. Julia arrived last, fashionably late as always, her arms thrown wide as she swept into the room, cheeks flushed with excitement. She looked radiant, her hair swept up, a bright red dress hugging her figure. She made a beeline for me, pulling me into a tight embrace. "You did all this?" she whispered, her eyes shining. I nodded, feeling a rush of pride and affection. Mark appeared at my side, offering Julia a glass of wine, and the three of us stood together for a moment, the heart of the celebration. I watched as Julia and Mark exchanged a quick smile, a shared joke passing between them. It was nothing unusual, I told myself. They'd always gotten along. The party unfolded in a blur of music and conversation. Julia was in her element, moving from group to group, her laughter rising above the din. Mark drifted through the crowd, topping off drinks, telling stories, and making everyone feel at home. I found myself playing hostess, making sure everyone had enough to eat, that coats were stowed away, that the playlist never ran out. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of Mark and Julia together, standing a little too close in the kitchen, their heads bent together over a shared memory, their laughter a little too private. Each time I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Jealousy? Insecurity? I brushed it off, telling myself I was being silly. At one point, I walked into the living room to find Julia and Mark deep in conversation on the sofa. Their heads were close, voices low. The rest of the party fading into the background. Julia's hand rested lightly on Mark's arm as she laughed at something he'd said. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of my place. Mark looked up and smiled, beckoning me over. "Come join us," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I sat down beside them, forcing myself to relax, to ignore the strange tension that seemed to hang in the air. The evening wore on, the room growing warmer as the wine flowed and the laughter grew louder. Julia opened her gifts, her eyes shining with gratitude as she hugged each friend in turn. When she unwrapped my present, a delicate silver bracelet engraved with a quote from our favorite book, she pulled me into another embrace, whispering, "You always know exactly what I need." I felt a surge of love for her, mixed with a pang of something sharper, something I didn't want to examine too closely. Later, as I cleared plates from the dining table, I caught sight of Mark and Julia standing together by the window, silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights. Their conversation was animated, their faces lit with excitement. I watched as Julia touched Mark's shoulder, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. My heart gave a small, involuntary jolt. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into a simple gesture between friends. But the feeling lingered, a faint unease threading through the evening. As the night drew to a close, guests began to say their goodbyes, lingering in the hallway for one last story, one last laugh. Julia was the last to leave, hugging me tightly and promising to call the next day. Mark walked her to her car, their voices drifting back through the open door. I stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, trying to shake the sense of displacement that had settled over me. When Mark returned, he was quiet, thoughtful, his eyes distant. I asked if everything was all right, and he smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Just tired," he said, pressing a kiss to my forehead. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I replayed the evening in my mind. The laughter, the warmth, the easy camaraderie that had always defined our friendship. But now there were shadows at the edges, moments that felt off, glances that lingered a beat too long, touches that seemed to carry more weight than before. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild. After all, I trusted them both. They were the two people I loved most in the world. Looking back, there were signs I missed, signs that would haunt me. The way Julia's laughter seemed to grow softer when Mark was near, the way his eyes followed her across the room, the way I felt like an outsider in my own home, if only for a moment. But that night, I chose to ignore the whispers of doubt, to hold on to the belief that everything was as it should be. I drifted off to sleep, unaware that the seeds of betrayal had already been sown, and that my world was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. In the weeks that followed Julia's birthday party, life seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. At first, it was so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Mark was still the same attentive husband, still made my morning coffee, still asked about my day. Julia still called, still sent me funny messages, still invited me for lunch. But there was a new undercurrent, a tension I couldn't quite name, and it began to color everything. Started with the phone. Mark had always been casual with his, leaving it on the kitchen counter or the nightstand, never bothering with passwords or secrecy. But now he seemed to keep it close, slipping it into his pocket when I entered the room, glancing at it with a distracted frown when he thought I wasn't looking. I noticed him stepping out onto the porch to take calls, his voice low and urgent, The conversations brief and unfinished when I appeared. When I asked who it was, he'd shrug and say it was work or a wrong number or nothing important. I wanted to believe him, but the explanations felt thin. Julia, too, seemed different. Our conversations, once effortless and open, became stilted. She'd cancel plans at the last minute, citing headaches or work emergencies. When we did meet, she was distracted, her eyes darting to her phone, her laughter forced. She'd ask about Mark in a way that felt rehearsed, as if she was checking a box. "How's Mark? He seemed tired at the party. Is everything all right?" I'd answer, trying to sound casual, but the questions lingered in my mind long after our lunches ended. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, Mark's phone buzzed on the dresser. He was in the shower, and I glanced at the screen out of habit. A message from Julia flashed across the display. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the words, willing them to mean something innocent, something I could explain away. But the message was quickly followed by another. "Delete these, okay?" My hands trembled as I set the phone back down, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. That night, I lay awake beside Mark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I wanted to shake him awake, to demand answers, to confront him with the evidence I'd stumbled upon. But fear held me back, fear of what he might say, fear of what I already suspected. Instead, I turned away, staring into the darkness, replaying every moment from the party, every glance, every touch, every laugh that now seemed loaded with meaning. The next day I called Julia, my voice trembling as I asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. She hesitated, then agreed, her tone unusually guarded. We met at our favorite cafe, the one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who always remembered our orders. Julia arrived late, her hair pulled back, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She smiled, but it didn't reach her face. We talked about work, about the weather, about everything except what was really on my mind. I watched her closely, searching for cracks in her composure, for any sign that my fears were unfounded. As we parted, Julia hugged me tightly, whispering, "You know I love you, right?" I nodded, unable to speak, the words catching in my throat. I watched her walk away, her shoulders hunched, her steps hurried. I wanted to call her back, to demand the truth, but I couldn't find the courage. Over the next few days, the distance between Mark and me grew. He worked late, claiming deadlines and meetings that seemed to multiply overnight. When he was home, he was distracted, his mind elsewhere. I tried to reach him, to bridge the gap, but every attempt was met with a polite smile, a gentle deflection, a promise to talk later. I felt invisible, a ghost in my own home, watching my marriage unravel thread by thread. One afternoon, I decided to surprise Mark at work, bringing him lunch from his favorite deli. I arrived at his office, only to find his assistant looking confused. "He left early today," she said. "Said he had a family emergency." My stomach twisted. I thanked her and left, my mind spinning with possibilities. I drove around aimlessly, searching for his car in parking lots, scanning the streets for any sign of him. I ended up at the park, sitting on a bench as the sun dipped below the horizon, feeling more alone than I had in years. That evening, Mark came home late, his hair mussed, his shirt untucked. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "Long day," he said, dropping his bag by the door. I wanted to ask where he'd been, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending everything was fine. The next morning, I found Julia's scarf in the back seat of Mark's car. It was unmistakable, bright blue silk, a gift from me on her last birthday. I held it in my hands, the fabric soft and familiar, and felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I placed it on the kitchen table, waiting for Mark to notice. When he did, he barely glanced at it. "Julia must have left it at the party," he said, his voice too casual. I nodded, but inside something broke. I started to keep a journal documenting every odd moment, every unexplained absence, every message that didn't add up. It became an obsession, a way to make sense of the chaos swirling around me. I reread old texts, replayed conversations in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. I questioned my own sanity, wondering if I was seeing patterns where none existed, if I was inventing problems to fill the silence that had crept into my life. But the evidence kept piling up. Late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Whispered conversations behind closed doors. Julia's sudden reluctance to spend time with me. Her excuses growing more elaborate with each passing day. Mark's growing impatience. His irritation at my questions. His refusal to meet my eyes. I started to wonder, was I imagining things? Or was something truly wrong? The doubt gnawed at me, eroding my confidence, making me question everything I thought I knew about the people I loved. I wanted to believe in their innocence, to trust in the bonds we had built over decades. But the cracks were widening, and I could no longer ignore the feeling that my world was shifting beneath my feet. Looking back, I wish I had confronted them sooner, demanded the truth before the lies took root. But fear is a powerful thing, and hope even more so. I clung to the belief that I was wrong, that I was overreacting, that love would be enough to hold us together. But deep down, I knew the truth was waiting just out of reach, ready to shatter the illusion of safety I had so carefully constructed. It's strange how the mind tries to protect itself from pain, how it clings to denial even as the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. I wanted so badly to believe that I was wrong, that the unease twisting in my stomach was nothing more than insecurity, a passing shadow. But the signs kept multiplying, each one sharper than the last, until they formed a pattern I could no longer dismiss. It was a Thursday afternoon when the truth began to unravel. Mark had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, something he rarely did anymore. I wasn't looking for anything, not really, but as I passed by, a notification popped up, a calendar reminder for a meeting at a small cafe across town. The name attached to the event was Julia's. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, willing myself to look away, to respect his privacy. But curiosity and dread overpowered me. I clicked on the event, reading the details. Lunch with Jay, 1 p.m. Don't be late. There was a string of similar entries, all on days when Mark had claimed to be working late or stuck in meetings. I sat down, my hands trembling, and scrolled through his messages. There were dozens of texts between Mark and Julia, some mundane, others more intimate than I could bear. Miss you already. Can't wait to see you. Last night was perfect. Each word felt like a blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I closed the laptop, my mind reeling, my heart racing with a mixture of fury and disbelief. For hours I wandered the house in a daze, replaying every moment from the past few weeks. The late nights, the secret of phone calls, the way Julia's eyes darted away from mine when I asked about her plans. It all made sense now, a puzzle snapping into place with cruel clarity. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to erase the memories that now felt tainted. But instead I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching a pillow to my chest, and let the tears come. Denial is a powerful force. Even with the evidence laid bare, I found myself searching for excuses, for explanations that would make it all less devastating. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they were planning a surprise for me. Something innocent and well-intentioned. But the messages were too clear, the meetings too frequent, the lies too practiced. I felt anger rising in me, hot and wild, but beneath it was a deeper ache, a sense of betrayal so profound it left me breathless. I thought about confronting Mark, about demanding the truth and forcing him to look me in the eye. But every time I imagined the conversation, I faltered. What if he denied it? What if he turned the blame on me, accused me of snooping, of being paranoid? What if he admitted everything, and I had to face the reality of losing not just my husband but my closest friend? The risk felt too great, the pain too raw. So I waited, gathering more evidence, hoping for a sign that would make the next step clear. The next day, I followed Mark after he left for work. I felt ridiculous, like a character in a bad movie, but desperation overruled my pride. I kept my distance, heart pounding as I watched him park outside the same cafe from his calendar. Minutes later, Julia arrived, her hair pulled back, sunglasses hiding her face. They greeted each other with a hug that lingered too long. Their bodies pressed close in a way that made my stomach twist. I watched from my car, tears streaming down my face, as they disappeared inside together. I sat there for nearly an hour watching the door, willing myself to march inside and confront them both. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a cocktail of emotions. Rage, humiliation, heartbreak, and a strange hollow numbness. When they finally emerged, laughing and holding hands, I shrank down in my seat, praying they wouldn't see me. Julia kissed Mark on the cheek before heading to her car, and he stood watching her go, a soft smile on his lips that I hadn't seen in months. That night I barely spoke to Mark. He noticed my silence, asking if I was feeling all right, but I brushed him off, claiming a headache. I watched him move through the house, every gesture now suspect, every word tinged with deceit. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I retreated into myself, building walls around my heart, trying to protect what little remained of my dignity. I tried to reach out to Julia, to salvage some piece of our friendship, but she was evasive, her responses clipped and hurried. "Busy week," she texted. "Let's catch up soon." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keys, wanting to type out everything I knew, everything I'd seen. But I couldn't bring myself to send the message. The fear of her confirmation, of hearing the truth in her own words, was more than I could bear. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and anxious days. I replayed every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of intimacy that now felt like a lie. I wondered how long it had been going on, how many times I had been the unwitting fool trusting people who had already betrayed me. The anger simmered beneath the surface, but it was the heartbreak that threatened to consume me. I began to question everything: my marriage, my friendship, my own judgment. How could I have missed the signs? How could I have been so blind? The self-doubt was relentless, eroding my confidence, making me second-guess every decision. The truth was closer than I dared to believe. It was in the way Mark avoided my gaze, in the way Julia's laughter no longer reached her eyes, in the silence that had settled between us like a thick fog. I knew I couldn't hide from it forever, that eventually I would have to confront them both and demand the answers I deserved. But for now, I hovered in that painful limbo, torn between the urge to fight for what was mine and the instinct to protect myself from further hurt. The secret meetings had shattered the illusion of safety I had clung to, leaving me adrift in a sea of uncertainty, searching for a way forward. The day I decided to confront them, the world felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I had rehearsed the conversation 100 times in my mind, picturing every possible outcome, every word I might say, every excuse they might offer. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of standing before the two people I loved most, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own voice. I waited until evening, when Mark was home and Julia had agreed to stop by for what she thought was a casual dinner. I set the table for 3, my hands trembling as I arranged the plates and silverware. The house felt colder than usual, the familiar room suddenly foreign. When Julia arrived, she greeted me with a hesitant smile, her eyes darting nervously to Mark, who stood by the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. The tension in the room was palpable, a storm gathering on the horizon. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the clink of cutlery and the hum of the refrigerator the only sounds. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I set down my fork and looked at them both, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I said. "I know about the two of you." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Mark's face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. Julia's hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment no one spoke. Then all at once the dam broke. Mark was the first to recover, his voice rising in protest. "What are you talking about? There's nothing going on." His denial was swift, almost automatic, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Julia shook her head, tears welling up as she stammered. "It's not what you think. We never meant for this to happen." I felt a surge of anger, hot and blinding. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice shaking. "I've seen the messages. I've seen you together. How long has this been going on?" My words echoed through the room, each one a blow. Julia broke down, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Just happened. We didn't plan it." Mark looked away, his face contorted with guilt and shame. It was a mistake, he muttered. We were both lonely. Things haven't been right between us for a long time. The excuses tumbled out, each one more painful than the last. They blamed stress, loneliness, the slow drift that had crept into our marriage. Julia insisted she still valued our friendship, that she never wanted to betray me. Mark claimed he still loved me, that he was confused, that he didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. I listened, numb, as they tried to justify the unjustifiable. Every word felt like a knife, reopening wounds I hadn't even realized were there. I wanted to scream, to throw them both out, to erase every memory we'd ever shared. But all I could do was sit there, tears streaming down my face, as the life I'd built crumbled around me. The confrontation quickly devolved into chaos. Mark grew defensive, accusing me of spying, of invading his privacy. If you trusted me, you wouldn't have gone through my things, he snapped. Julia tried to mediate, pleading with both of us to calm down, but her words only fueled the fire. I lashed out, accusing them of gaslighting me, of making me doubt my own sanity. The room was filled with shouting, accusations, and bitter recriminations. At some point, Julia stood up, her face streaked with tears. I can't do this, she whispered, grabbing her purse and fleeing the house. The door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Mark slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, silent and defeated. I sat there for a long time after they left, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I felt hollow, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. The anger that had sustained me through the confrontation faded, replaced by a crushing sense of isolation. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. I wandered through the house, touching the objects that had once brought me comfort. The family photos on the mantel, the books Julia had given me, the sweater Mark had bought for my last birthday. Everything felt tainted, every memory soured by betrayal. I tried to call a friend, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know how to explain the depth of my pain, the sense of loss that threatened to swallow me whole. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation over and over in my mind. I wondered if I could have done something differently, if there was a moment when I could have changed the outcome. But the truth was, the damage had been done long before I found the courage to speak. The trust that had once bound us together was gone, replaced by suspicion and resentment. In the days that followed the confrontation, my world shrank to the four walls of my home. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock, or the distant hum of traffic outside. I moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by memories of laughter and warmth that now felt impossibly distant. Every room held echoes of what I'd lost. Mark's slippers by the bed, Julia's favorite mug in the cupboard, the framed photos of holidays and birthdays that now seemed to mock me with their frozen smiles. I stopped answering calls and ignored the sympathetic texts that trickled in from friends who had heard vague rumors but didn't know the full story. I couldn't bear the thought of explaining, of reliving the humiliation and betrayal. I felt exposed, as if everyone could see the cracks in my life, the evidence of my failure as a wife and a friend. Shame settled over me like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe, let alone reach out for help. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, replaying every moment of my marriage, searching for the point where things had gone wrong. Was it a careless word, a missed anniversary, or the slow erosion of intimacy that comes with years of routine? I wondered if I had been too trusting, too complacent, too willing to believe that love was enough to keep us safe. The questions circled endlessly, offering no comfort, only more pain. I thought about Julia, about the countless hours we'd spent confiding in each other, sharing secrets and dreams. I remembered the way she'd held my hand when my mother died, the way she'd made me laugh when I thought I'd never smile again. How could she have betrayed me so completely? I tried to hate her, to summon the anger I knew I should feel, but all I could manage was a deep, aching sadness. I missed her, even as I mourned the loss of our friendship. Mark's absence was a different kind of wound. The routines we'd built together, morning coffee, evening walks, the quiet comfort of shared silence were gone, leaving only emptiness in their place. I missed the sound of his voice, the warmth of his hand in mine, the sense of safety I'd always taken for granted. But I also missed the woman I'd been before the betrayal. The woman who believed in love and loyalty, who trusted without reservation. For a while, I let myself wallow in grief. I stayed in bed for days, eating little, speaking less. I let the house fall into disarray. Dishes piling up in the sink, laundry left unfolded. I avoided mirrors, unable to face the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at me. I felt invisible, irrelevant, as if my life had been reduced to a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. But grief, I learned, is not a straight line. It ebbs and flows, receding just enough to let in slivers of light. One morning I found myself standing at the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. A quiet determination, a stubborn refusal to let betrayal define me. I realized that I had a choice. I could let the actions of others destroy me, or I could begin the slow, difficult work of rebuilding myself. I started small. I cleaned the kitchen, scrubbing away the remnants of old meals and old memories. I opened the windows, letting in fresh air and sunlight. I took long walks through the neighborhood, breathing deeply, reminding myself that the world was still turning, that life was still happening outside my grief. I began to write again, filling page after page with my thoughts and fears, my anger and my hope. The words became a lifeline, a way to make sense of the chaos inside me. Slowly, I reached out to friends, not the ones who had chosen sides or offered empty platitudes, but those who listened without judgment, who sat with me in silence when words were too much. Their kindness reminded me that I was not alone, that I was still worthy of love and friendship, even if I had been betrayed by those I trusted most. I forgave myself for not seeing the signs, for loving too deeply, for believing in the best of people. I let go of the shame that had weighed me down, replacing it with compassion for the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I learned to set boundaries, to protect my heart without closing it off completely. In my darkest moments, I found a strength I never knew I had. It wasn't the kind of strength that roars or demands attention, but a quiet resilience, a steady resolve to keep moving forward, no matter how slowly. I realized that healing was not about forgetting or pretending the pain never happened, but about honoring my own worth, reclaiming my story, and choosing to live on my own terms. The aftermath of betrayal left me battered and bruised, but it also revealed the depth of my courage. I was still standing, still breathing, still capable of hope. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that I would not let this chapter be the end of my story. I thought the worst was over, but the real shock was yet to come. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I had no idea that the events of that night were only the beginning, that the fallout from their betrayal would reach further than I could ever have imagined. The storm had broken, but its aftermath would test me in ways I was not prepared to face. After weeks of drifting through my days in a fog, I realized I needed to get away. The walls of my home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, every corner echoing with memories I could no longer bear. I packed a small suitcase with little thought, tossing in comfortable clothes, a few books, and my journal. I left a note on the kitchen table, short, simple, and final. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not anymore. I drove to my sister's house in the countryside, a place I hadn't visited in years. The drive itself was a kind of therapy, the steady hum of the engine and the blur of passing fields soothing my frayed nerves. My sister welcomed me with open arms, asking no questions, offering only her quiet presence and a warm bed. She seemed to understand that I needed space, that words would come in their own time. The first few days I slept more than I had in months. I let myself be cared for, accepting Anne's gentle kindness without protest. She made tea in the mornings, left fresh towels on the bed, and filled the house with the comforting smells of home-cooked meals. I spent hours sitting on her porch, watching the sun rise and set, letting the rhythm of nature calm the storm inside me. Slowly I began to feel the weight lift. Away from the reminders of betrayal, I could finally breathe. I took long walks through the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet grounding me in the present. I watched birds flit from branch to branch, listened to the wind rustling through the trees, and felt the sun warm my face. Each day I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself, and encouraged me to talk but never pushed. When I was ready, I told her everything. The party, the secret meetings, the confrontation that had shattered my world. She listened without judgment, her eyes full of empathy and understanding. She reminded me that I was not defined by what had happened to me, that I was still whole, still worthy of love and happiness. I began to rediscover the things that once brought me joy. I read novels late into the night, losing myself in stories that had nothing to do with my own pain. I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years, letting color and movement express what words could not. I wrote in my journal every day, pouring out my fears, my anger, my hopes for the future. The act of creation became a form of healing, a way to reclaim the parts of myself I thought I had lost. As the days passed, I started to plan my next steps. I made lists of things I wanted to do, places I wanted to visit, dreams I had put on hold for too long. I thought about what it would mean to return home, to face the remnants of my old life with new eyes. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that the pain would still be there, but I also knew I was stronger than I had ever imagined. One afternoon, and then I sat on the porch watching the sky turn pink and gold. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. I believed her. For the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. I left to find peace, but what I returned to would change everything. As I packed my bags and hugged in goodbye, I felt a sense of anticipation, a quiet readiness for whatever lay ahead. I was no longer running from my pain but moving toward a future I was determined to shape for myself. The road home was uncertain, but I knew I would walk it with my head held high, guided by the strength I had found in the quiet moments of escape and healing. I drove home on a quiet Sunday morning, the sky a pale blue, the world washed clean by an overnight rain. The countryside faded into suburbs, then into the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I felt a strange mix of anxiety and resolve as I turned onto my street, my heart pounding with every mile that brought me closer to the life I'd left behind. I had rehearsed my return in my mind 100 times, imagining how I would reclaim my space, how I would face the ghosts that lingered in every room. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw in my own home. The driveway was crowded with cars, more than I expected, more than made sense for a quiet weekend morning. I parked at the curb, my hands trembling as I gathered my things. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with a gentle push. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of home mingling with something sharper, a tension in the air that set my nerves on edge. Voices drifted from the TV lounge, low and urgent, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clink of glasses. I set my bag down quietly, moving down the hallway with cautious steps. As I reached the doorway, I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The scene before me was so surreal, so out of place, that for a moment I wondered if I was dreaming. Mark was there, sitting on the edge of the sofa, his posture tense, his face flushed. Julia stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. But they weren't alone. Scattered around the room were several of our closest friends, people who had been at Julia's birthday party, people who had called to check on me in the weeks since I'd left. They all looked up as I entered, their faces registering shock, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. The television was on, but the sound was muted. On the coffee table sat an open bottle of wine, half-empty glasses, and a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like legal documents. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Julia was the first to break the silence. "You're back," she said, her voice brittle. She glanced at Mark, then at the others as if searching for support. Mark stood up, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We didn't expect you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at each of them in turn, searching their faces for answers. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. One of our friends, Lisa, stepped forward, her face pale. "We're here because we needed to talk," she said quietly. "About everything that's happened. About you. About Mark and Julia." She hesitated, glancing at the stack of papers on the table. We thought it was time for the truth to come out. I felt the room tilt, the ground shifting beneath my feet. The truth. I echoed, my voice hollow. Mark looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed. We've been meeting with everyone, he said. Trying to explain. Trying to make amends, I guess. He gestured helplessly at the others. We thought if we could talk it out, maybe we could fix things. Maybe we could find a way forward. Julia's voice trembled as she spoke. We didn't want you to find out like this. We were going to tell you, but then you left, and everything got so complicated. She looked down, twisting her hands together. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The others shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others watching me with open sympathy. I realized, with a jolt, that this was an intervention of sorts, a gathering of friends who had been drawn into the fallout of our betrayal, who had chosen to confront the mess head-on rather than let it fester in silence. Lisa picked up the papers from the table, holding them out to me. These are letters, she said. From all of us. We wanted you to know how much you mean to us, how much we hate what's happened. We wanted to be honest, even if it hurts. I took the stack with shaking hands, my eyes blurring as I scanned the first page. Words of regret, of sorrow, of support. Apologies for not seeing the signs, for not stepping in sooner, for not being the friends I needed when my world was falling apart. Each letter was a lifeline, a reminder that I was not as alone as I had felt. Mark moved closer, his voice raw. I know I've hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to try. I want to be better. For you, for us, for everyone in this room. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back, the pain still too fresh, the wounds too deep. Julia wiped her eyes, her voice barely audible. I betrayed you. I betrayed our friendship. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to hear it from me, not from whispers or rumors. The room was silent again, the weight of confession settling over us all. I looked around at the faces of people I had trusted, people who had been part of my life for decades. I saw guilt, but also hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all this pain. I stood there, clutching the letters to my chest, my mind racing. I had come home expecting to find emptiness, to face my grief alone. Instead, I found a room full of people willing to face the truth, to own their mistakes, to try and make things right. It wasn't the reunion I had imagined, but it was real, raw, and honest. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw in my own home. The shock of betrayal was still there, but so was the possibility of healing, of rebuilding, of starting again. As I looked into the eyes of my husband, my friend, and the people who had stood by me through it all, I realized that the next chapter of my life would be written not in isolation, but in the messy, complicated company of those who cared enough to stay. The days that followed my return blurred together, each one heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a stage where every conversation was loaded, every silence thick with things unsaid. The letters from my friends sat in a neat stack on my nightstand, their words of regret and support both a balm and a reminder of how much had been lost. I read them over and over, searching for answers, for a way to make sense of the chaos that had upended my life. Word of what happened spread quickly. In a community as close-knit as ours, secrets never stayed hidden for long. Neighbors who once waved from their porches now watched me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some offered awkward words of comfort, while others kept their distance, unsure of what to say. I felt exposed, as if my pain was on display for everyone to see. The betrayal was no longer just mine. It had become a story whispered at dinner tables and over fences, a cautionary tale that belonged to everyone. My family's reactions were as varied as the people themselves. My sister called every day, her voice steady and reassuring, reminding me that I was loved, that I would get through this. My brother, always the pragmatist, offered advice about lawyers and property, his concern masked by a need to fix things. My children, grown and living their own lives, struggled to process the news. They called with questions, with anger, with tears. I tried to shield them from the worst of it, but I knew they felt the loss as deeply as I did. The foundation of our family had cracked, and we were all scrambling to find our footing. Mark moved through the house like a shadow, his presence both a comfort and a source of pain. He tried to talk, to explain, to apologize, but I wasn't ready to listen. Every word felt like another wound. Every attempt at reconciliation a reminder of what he had destroyed. Julia, too, reached out, her messages full of remorse and longing for forgiveness. I read them, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The hurt was too fresh, the trust too broken. Friends who had been at the intervention checked in regularly, their support unwavering. They invited me for coffee, for walks, for quiet evenings spent talking about anything but the betrayal. Their kindness was a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. Yet, even in their company, I felt a distance, a sense that I was changed in ways I couldn't yet articulate. I was grateful for their presence, but I also craved solitude, time to process, to grieve, to decide what came next. The community's reaction was more complicated. Some people rallied around me, offering support and encouragement. Others seemed to take a perverse pleasure in the drama, dissecting every detail, speculating about motives and outcomes. I learned to tune out the gossip, to focus on the voices that mattered. Still, the sense of being watched, of being judged, was hard to shake. I wondered if I would ever feel truly at home in this place again. As the initial shock faded, I found myself at a crossroads. The urge for revenge was strong. A part of me wanted to lash out, to make Mark and Julia feel the pain they had caused. I imagined dramatic confrontations, public shaming, legal battles that would leave no doubt about who was in the right. But another part of me, quieter but no less insistent, urged caution. I had seen what bitterness could do, how it could consume a person from the inside out. I didn't want to become someone defined by anger, by the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Forgiveness seemed impossible, at least at first. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal too raw. But as the days passed, I began to see forgiveness not as a gift to Mark or Julia, but as a way to free myself from the hold they still had on my heart. I realized that holding on to anger would only prolong my suffering, that true healing would require letting go not for their sake, but for mine. I spent long hours walking through the neighborhood, thinking about what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. I considered leaving, starting over in a new place where no one knew my story. I thought about selling the house, about traveling, about reinventing myself in ways I had never dared before. Each option felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder that my future was still unwritten. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, I sat on the porch with Anne. She listened as I poured out my fears, my hopes, my uncertainty. "You don't have to decide everything right now," she said gently. "Take your time. Do what feels right for you." Her words were a comfort, a reminder that I was allowed to move at my own pace, to choose my own path. In the end, I realized that I didn't have to choose revenge or forgiveness, at least not right away. I could choose something else entirely. I could choose myself. I could focus on healing, on rebuilding, on rediscovering the parts of me that had been lost in the chaos. I could surround myself with people who loved me, who saw my worth, who supported my journey no matter how long it took. Would I choose revenge, forgiveness, or something else entirely? The answer, I discovered, was not as simple as I once believed. It was a process, a journey, a series of small steps taken one day at a time. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was strong enough to face it. The truth had come out, the consequences had been faced, and now it was up to me to decide what came next. The first step in rebuilding my life was the hardest, admitting that I deserved better, that I was allowed to put myself first. For so long, I had measured my worth by the happiness of others, by the stability of my marriage, by the strength of my friendships. Now, with those old certainties gone, I was forced to look inward, to ask myself what I truly wanted and needed. It was a question I hadn't dared to ask in years. I started small. I changed the locks on the doors, a practical step that felt deeply symbolic. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I needed to feel safe within its walls. I boxed up the things that reminded me of Mark and Julia. Their gifts, their photos, the little mementos that once brought joy but now only reopened wounds. Some I donated. Others I tucked away in the attic, out of sight but not quite out of mind. The house felt emptier but also lighter, as if I had cleared space for something new. Setting boundaries was unfamiliar territory. When Mark called, I let it go to voicemail. When Julia sent long, apologetic emails, I read them but didn't reply. I realized that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on my terms and my timeline. I owed them nothing, not my time, not my energy, not my peace. It was liberating to say no, to draw a line and hold it, even when it hurt. I began to reclaim my routines, but this time, I shaped them for myself. I woke up early and walked through the neighborhood, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling my body grow stronger with each step. I tried new recipes, filling the kitchen with unfamiliar scents and flavors. I rearranged the furniture, painted the walls a soft blue, bought fresh flowers for the dining table. Each change, however small, was a declaration. I am here and this is my life. Support came from unexpected places. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by with casseroles and kind words. An old friend from college, hearing about my situation through the grapevine, reached out and invited me to join her book club. I hesitated at first, afraid of pity or awkward questions, but the group welcomed me with open arms. We met every other week, sharing stories and laughter over coffee and pastries. For the first time in months, I felt seen for who I was, not just for what I had endured. I also found solace in solitude. I spent afternoons in the garden, hands deep in the earth, coaxing new life from the soil. I rediscovered my love of painting, setting up an easel by the window and losing myself in color and form. I journaled every day, pouring out my thoughts and dreams, my fears and hopes. The act of creation was healing, a way to stitch together the pieces of myself that had been torn apart. Financial independence became another pillar of my new life. I met with a financial advisor, reviewed my accounts, and made a plan for the future. I learned to manage my own affairs, to trust my judgment, to make decisions without seeking approval. It was daunting at first, but with each step my confidence grew. I realized that I was capable, resourceful, and resilient, qualities I had always admired in others but rarely recognized in myself. As I rebuilt, I made a conscious effort to nurture relationships that were healthy and reciprocal. I reached out to and more often, grateful for her unwavering support. I deepened my connection with my children, inviting them over for dinners and long walks, listening to their stories and sharing my own. I let go of friendships that felt one-sided or draining, choosing instead to invest in people who lifted me up. There were setbacks, of course. Some days the loneliness crept in, whispering that I would never truly heal, that I would always be defined by what had happened. On those days, I allowed myself to grieve, to feel the sadness without judgment. But I also reminded myself of how far I had come, of the strength I had discovered in the aftermath of loss. Gradually, I began to dream again. I planned a trip to the coast, something I had always wanted to do but never found the time for. I signed up for a painting class at the local community center, eager to learn new techniques and meet new people. I volunteered at the library, reading to children on Saturday mornings, finding joy in their laughter and curiosity. Each new experience was a step toward reclaiming my life, toward building a future that belonged to me alone. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. I was no longer defined by my roles as wife or friend, no longer bound by the expectations of others. I was free to choose, to explore, to grow. The pain of betrayal had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it had become a part of my story, a chapter that, while painful, had led me to a place of greater strength and self-awareness. As I stood in my newly painted living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but I also knew that I was capable of facing them. I had survived the storm, and now I was ready to embrace whatever came next. My life was my own, and I was determined to make it beautiful. Just when I thought the story was over, fate had one more surprise. Life, I was learning, rarely moved in straight lines. Healing was not a destination, but a journey, and sometimes the past circled back in ways I could never have predicted. It started with a phone call from Julia. I hadn't heard her voice in months, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity, and perhaps a lingering sense of unfinished business, made me answer. Her voice was shaky, stripped of its usual confidence. She told me she needed to see me, that something had happened, and she didn't know who else to turn to. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Julia looked different when I arrived. The spark that once defined her was gone, replaced by a weary sadness. She fidgeted with her cup, eyes darting around the room before finally meeting mine. "I know I have no right to ask for your time," she began, but I didn't know where else to go. I listened in silence, unsure what to expect. She told me that the man she'd started seeing after Mark, someone she'd met through mutual friends, had betrayed her. He'd lied about his past, about his intentions, and when she discovered the truth, he'd left without a word. Julia's voice trembled as she described the loneliness, the shame, the realization that she had been used. "I thought I was starting over," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I ended up right back where I started, alone." For a moment I felt a flicker of old pain, the echo of my own betrayal. But instead of anger, I felt something unexpected, compassion. I saw Julia not as the friend who had hurt me, but as a woman struggling to find her way, just as I had. I reached across the table and took her hand, offering comfort without words. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a turning point. I realized that forgiveness in its truest form was not about excusing the past, but about freeing myself from its hold. A few weeks later, another twist arrived, this time in the form of Mark. He showed up at my door one evening, looking older, thinner, and more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. He asked if we could talk, and though my first instinct was to send him away, I found myself inviting him in. We sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy with memories. Mark apologized again, but this time there was no defensiveness, no excuses. He told me about the emptiness he'd felt since I left, about the mistakes he'd made, about the work he was doing to understand himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness or a second chance. He simply wanted me to know that he was trying to be better. I listened, my heart steady. I realized that I no longer needed his validation, that my healing did not depend on his remorse. As Mark stood to leave, he paused at the door. "You look happy," he said quietly. "I'm glad." I smiled, feeling the truth of his words. I was happy not in the way I once imagined, but in a deeper, quieter sense. I had built a life for myself, one rooted in self-respect and possibility. The final twist came from within. One afternoon, as I was volunteering at the library, a woman approached me. She was new to town, recently divorced and looking for a fresh start. We struck up a conversation and I found myself sharing pieces of my story. Not the pain but the lessons, the hope, the resilience. She thanked me, saying it was exactly what she needed to hear. In that moment I realized how far I had come. My story, once a source of shame, had become a source of strength, not just for me, but for others as well. Life continued to surprise me. There were new friendships, new adventures, and even the possibility of new love. But I no longer measured my worth by the presence or absence of others. I had learned to trust myself, to set boundaries, to embrace the unexpected with an open heart. Just when I thought the story was over, fate had one more surprise. But this time I was ready. I welcomed the twists and turns, knowing that whatever came next, I had the strength to face it. My past no longer defined me. I was the author of my own story, and I was finally free to write the next chapter on my own terms. Closure didn't arrive all at once. It came in gentle waves, in quiet moments when I least expected it. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic ending, just a gradual softening of the pain, a growing sense of peace that settled over my life like a warm blanket. I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened or pretending it hadn't hurt. It was about accepting the past, learning from it, and choosing to move forward with grace. Forgiveness, too, was a process. I forgave Julia, not because she asked for it or because she deserved it, but because I needed to let go of the bitterness that threatened to harden my heart. I forgave Mark, not to erase his betrayal, but to free myself from the weight of anger. Most importantly, I forgave myself for not seeing the signs, for loving too deeply, for holding on when I should have let go. That self-forgiveness was the hardest, but also the most liberating. As the seasons changed, so did I. I found joy in the small things, the laughter of children at the library, the scent of fresh flowers in my garden, the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. I learned to savor my own company, to cherish the solitude that once felt so daunting. I discovered new passions, new friends, and a new sense of purpose. I traveled to places I'd only dreamed of, stood on windswept cliffs, and watched the sun rise over distant horizons. Each experience was a reminder that life was still full of possibility. There were moments when loneliness crept in, when memories threatened to pull me back into the darkness. But I no longer feared those moments. I welcomed them as part of my story, as proof of how far I had come. I understood now that strength wasn't about never falling, but about rising each time I did. I was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had found within myself. In time, I opened my heart to the idea of love again. Not the desperate, clinging love of the past, but a gentle, steady affection that grew from friendship and mutual respect. I met someone who saw me for who I was, who valued my independence and encouraged my dreams. It was different this time, no illusions, no need to lose myself to be loved. I entered this new relationship as a whole person, complete in myself, ready to share my life but not surrender it.